workshop 2020. We didn't receive any more questions, these additional questions in the morning session for Sonia or for Larry. So we have Professor Larry Johnson today. I mentioned to you is a former Assistant Secretary General of Legal Affairs and Conference Management. Is the most knowledgeable people that I know about the proceedings and the rule of procedures of the General Assembly. So I have some questions related to the rule of procedure this morning. In a face-to-face format, this is the most cheerful part of the training due to the situation we have to do it virtually. Hopefully it'll be as engaging as always has been. Larry is teaching at Columbia University and is still doing some advisory work for the United Nations. He's a dear friend, and I will not steal any more of his time. So please challenging him. There are many questions about the rule of procedures, about motion of no action, about a set of tools, I call it then weapons for a diplomat, that you can use when you wanted to impede a draft resolution to go forward, an initiative. And there are the same rules that apply that you can use to defend your proposals and to fight against anybody who wanted to postpone a meeting or to present amendments to your ideas, to amendments to change the nature of your resolution and things like that. So Larry has been working with us for several years now, and I can testify that you will be really thrilled about his presentation. Again, please challenge him about the rule of procedure of the General Assembly. Larry, I'm going to yield to you. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and you have a good turnout, close to 200, 78 participants. So I'd let you with this process that we envisioned for this afternoon. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, undeserved. Although I noticed at the end you invited lots of challenges addressed to me. So, and please do so. The reason a lawyer is involved in this is that traditionally in the Secretariat, the legal office provides legal advice to secretariats of bodies and to chairpersons of committees, but on rules of procedure issues. So indeed, in your missions, if you have a legal advisor or a lawyer, most often that person will be asked to advise on your own delegation's strategies towards rules of procedure. So we'll get to the rules more or less tomorrow, but we're leading up to it today in the afternoon session, looking at negotiations and of draft resolutions and how to strategize getting your text, your proposal adopted. Now this, you have to realize that the one who knows about negotiations, and I'm throwing this right back to Marco, is a former ambassador of Honduras, and who was the former chair of, I believe, the second committee. It was the fifth committee too, Marco. I think in any event, delegations are the ones that negotiate. Secretariats do not. So we have observed and sometimes are brought into negotiations if there are technical questions. But to begin with, and to sort of follow up a little bit on what we were discussing this morning, and I was mistaken, I have to apologize. I thought Mr. Afifi would be available tomorrow afternoon, but unfortunately he is not. So I will try to cover to the extent that we can the financial implications once we get to it in our discussions today and somewhat tomorrow. But the very first thing you have to think about when you're drafting something for approval Either it's your bright idea, or it's your foreign minister's bright idea, or it's your head of state's bright idea. Anyway, you've been given instructions that you need to draft a resolution and get something adopted. That's your task. So you have to first decide how do you want to frame it. And I have to pay tribute to all of you whose mother tongue is not English or French, because words matter, language matters, and hats off to all of you who are able to master English, because most of the drafting, at least in New York, is done in English first, sometimes in French. But anyway, you have to figure out whether you want a resolution or a decision. And I think we touched on that a little bit briefly, but let me give you an example of a decision. And you can go through, show you a little bit the difference. 22 Rev 1. If you can find it, the draft. Yeah, it's coming. Nope, yeah, no, that's a resolution. It's L22 Rev 1. It's called convening a conference. There it is. There we are. Okay, great. So you see that it has a list of co-sponsors like any other, like a resolution, like anything else. But you see it doesn't have any preambular paragraphs. It just begins, the GA decides, A, B, C, D. And it's a rather long decision. Often decisions are quite brief. I'll give you an example. Those of you in the 6th committee, or those of you in committees that are going to be postponing items, often you'll have a decision. General Assembly decides to postpone until the following session via conference on the right of the whales, for example. This is a little bit longer. So this was the draft decision that was placed before the 1st committee. And then, in fact, we can jump to what is our first example of a PBI, program budget implications. So you see, this is the proposal. Now, that proposal is calling for a conference. And conferences don't fall from the sky. They cost money. And unless they've been planned for years ahead of time and have been put into the budget, extra money has to be appropriated for that purpose. So that's why, as we discussed this morning, there's a rule in the rules of procedure that says before a committee is going to adopt a proposal which has money implications, they need to get some idea that how much it's going to cost. So then the Secretary General will go to the first, say, it will not cost any extra money, the money is already in the budget, so it'll be absorbed, and that's that famous phrase, within existing resources. If the money's not there, then you're going to get this kind of statement from the Secretary General. And you can go through it here. It reviews what is the proposal, and then it talks about how does that relate to the rest of the budget. And then it talks about the activities that the request is going to entail, what has to be implemented. And the bottom line at the very end, you'll get to it, is modifications required in the budget, financial implications. And there you get a little table there, additional resource requirements. So this is the money required. Now, if you're in the 1st committee, you're in disarmament, and this is a great proposal for the establishment of a Middle East nuclear-free zone. So what do you know about the money? I mean, it just means that when you adopt the substance, when you think it's a good idea to have a conference for a nuclear-free Middle East zone, it's going to cost money. Or the Secretary General thinks it's going to cost money. So then once if the 1st committee adopts this decision, then it goes, and the Secretariat will do this, it goes to the 5th committee, and the budget people that have prepared this very document take this document and take it to the ACABQ, the Advisory Committee on Budgetary, Administrative, and Budgetary Questions. They're the experts. And they look at it, And they will look at these estimates from the Secretary General, and they may say, well, maybe it's too much or maybe it's not enough. And they will report to their parent body, the fifth committee, Budget Committee. We'll discuss it, ACABQ will make a recommendation, and then the fifth committee will decide what it really is going to cost, or how much it's going to have to be added to the budget, how much can be absorbed within the budget, so that when it goes to the plenary will have before it this resolution that was adopted in the first committee, the Disarmament Committee, about a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, and they will have a report of the fifth committee that says, this is how much it's going to cost. And then the resolution could be put to the vote in the plenary of the General Assembly. So we're sort of handled both things in one shot here. You could see how a decision is drafted. It's a very simple thing without any preambular paragraphs, and just goes directly to short and snappy decisions. And with that, let's look at what a normal resolution. I'm sure most of you have already seen these, but there are different kinds of resolutions. And the first one, Paleo, I'd put up is the General Assembly resolution on the coronavirus. That is 74/270. Right. So here's a resolution, an example of a resolution adopted by consensus. So, it's all been cooked beforehand. It doesn't have too much controversial in it, but here you see the preambular paragraphs, noting with great concern, recognizing, welcoming, acknowledging. All of these are considerations that lead up to your PPs, or your OPs, your operative paragraphs, excuse me. So then you have the numbers, and those are all operative paragraphs. They have decisions, reaffirms, emphasizes, expresses, calls for, so on and so forth. Now you might see nothing was adopted. When was it? April 20th, I believe. April 2nd. This would not be adopted by consensus today. If you look at paragraph 5, you will have, from a procedural sense, if this were proposed today, you would no doubt be an amendment. Someone would ask for an amendment to paragraph 5 to take out the final phrases applying the relevant guidelines recommended by the World Health Organization. In view of the U.S. having withdrawn from the World Health Organization, I think it might be a fairly safe guess that the U.S. would not be interested in having positive references to WHO guidelines anymore. So, this is sort of a precursor of something that we can talk about tomorrow. How would you change that if it comes up as a proposal? But in any event, this is one example of a resolution that was adopted by consensus. And those are resolutions that are contested and are controversial. And indeed, this morning, one of you mentioned country-specific human rights resolutions. And Palau, if you can throw that one up, that's the latest. The other resolution example I wanted to throw up, 2397. And I apologize to any participants from Myanmar, because it just happens to be about Myanmar. So, and this resolution was adopted, 2397. That's a Security Council resolution. My mistake. You have the resolution on 246. That's it. Yeah. This resolution was adopted by a vote of 134 in favor, 9 against, and 28 abstentions. So you see it's a much longer resolution, and you can see the language used in a preambular paragraph: guided, reaffirming, welcoming, so on and so forth. Look at all of these terms that you saw this morning in that chart that Sonia mentioned, with the different language, operative language and preambular language. So it's a very long resolution, and it refers to all kinds of things having to do with the Human Rights Council and discussion of the situation in Myanmar. Then you come with paragraphs 1, 2, 3, so on, the operative paragraphs. Now you'll see here, and this gets into a little bit of what was discussed this morning in terms of compliance. Now you'll see that this gives you the views of the General Assembly, the membership, the majority, on this issue. But there's no requirements here because the General Assembly doesn't have the authority to coerce any individual state or group of states. Only the Security Council can do that in Chapter 7. So it urges this, that, and the other thing. And then 6 is the one addressed to the government that is the target, to put it that way, reiterates the urgent call upon the government of XXX. And then they go through a list of what the General Assembly majority would like the government to do. So you go through that list. And obviously this kind of detail and this kind of language that is used is clearly not designed to achieve consensus. And that's known from the very beginning. And then the question there, from your point of view, is to what extent can you get as much a majority as possible for your own proposal? Thank you very much. That gives you the 2 examples of a General Assembly resolution that was hotly contested, controversial, and no doubt probably the subject of some interesting procedural maneuvers at the time. And the other example of a General Assembly resolution which was by consensus. Now let's go back to show you the difference between a General Assembly resolution and a Security Council resolution. This one here, 2397, yes. This is a good example of a sanctions resolution. It's a sanctions resolution, Chapter 7 against the DPRK. And you can see that preambular language more or less follows what you find in the GA until you get down to, say, the last paragraph. As I mentioned before, this is what is also sometimes called the kicker, because here you have as a preambular paragraph acting under Chapter 7 of the Charter and taking measures under Article 41, which is non-use of force sanctions. And you have here condemns, reaffirms, so on. That's fine. You could have that in a GA resolution. But then you get into language that you would probably rarely ever see, if at all, in a General Assembly resolution. Paragraph 4 decides that all states shall. Paragraph 5 decides that all states shall prohibit, so on and so forth. General Assembly can't do that. Only the Security Council, when it takes a decision, that is requirement language, shall. So if we keep going down, there are other, very detailed, of course. And here's decides, the other paragraphs where it decides what member states have to do. This paragraph 6 decides what one individual state must do, decides that the DPRK shall not, so on and so forth. That's again where the council is acting in its Chapter 7. Another one decides all states shall. Now, you could have in this resolution, if you go through the rest of the paragraphs, they're not all binding. It's only the language. You could say, you know, here we have the council notes with great concern, expresses concern. You could have a paragraph that recommends that all states should do something or other. But that doesn't, just because there are some provisions that are binding doesn't make it all binding. You have to look at the language. The words matter. But when you see words like decides that member states or a state shall, then you're into what was intended in the Charter as an enforcement measure. So again, I just wanted to point that out. There are differences in language and in terms of what the Security Council says when it's acting in a Chapter 7 sense, and any particular questions on that? Let me see the chats. Let's see, if the 5th committee recommends to the plenary there are no allocations available in the budget to implement, what will the suitable action be taken by the plenary in this regard? This means that if the Secretary General, just like in that case we showed you, and we can get copies of that from UNITAR, from Palaio. The Secretary General says, we don't have money for this big conference. So you have to appropriate money and add it to the budget. This is why it goes to the fifth. So the fifth committee is the one, it's not for the budget people to say, this is not a good idea to have a conference on zone. So that's where you get your difference between the people from Treasury, who are responsible for finding the money and allocating the right amount of money, and a committee that deals with the substance. So you've got the first committee saying, we need this conference, and we've decided to do it. And then it's the fifth committee to either find the money or appropriate the money. They have to find the money. They can't turn around to the first committee and say, well, we don't have the money in the budget, so we don't think it's a good idea to have this conference. The fifth committee would have to say, if you're going to adopt it because you think it's a good idea, you will have to add to the budget and your bill to the organization, which is why, as I come to it, if your proposal has a money figure attached to it, you may have trouble getting enough support. What are the most common mistakes to avoid to ensure adoption? We'll go through that as the afternoon goes forward. But as I said, one of them is the money. If you make a proposal, no, I can't do that if it means increasing our debt and increasing the bill to my foreign ministry, the foreign minister is not going to like it. And I can't vote in favor of it because it means the taxpayers of my country are going to pay more to the UN. What about, yet another question is, how about resolutions in an extraordinary session? Are they processed differently? No, they're processed the same. But I want to, so whether it's an emergency special session, regular, it's all handled the same, although it can, when the money is involved, and if the fifth committee is not in session, that has created problems in the past. But I think these days the fifth committee is more or less on call all year long. So let's see, I have another question. Cannot use shall as is in the Security Council, which gives that enforcement as you could have the General Assembly telling the Secretary General shall, but the way it has operated always is the General Assembly requests the Secretary General, but the position of the Secretariat is the Secretary General has no option. He could go back to the committee and say, well, you were proposing and requesting me to produce a 900-volume study of the causes of war, and I can't do that. I don't have and he can indicate the problems he would have in complying. But normally, whenever the Secretary General is requested to do something, that is interpreted as a shall. The other place where you might have the General Assembly using the word shall in trying to, if not coerce, order countries to do something is in the budget field, because there is the one area assembly to adopt the budget and allocate the expenses of the organization. So in those cases, you could have the General Assembly perhaps adopting, certainly when it adopts the budget, that's binding, because the charter says, and that budget, which has been adopted by the General Assembly, is binding on all states. So in that state, you might have the word shall used coming out of the fifth committee, because that has nothing to do with the Security Council or maintenance of peace and security. But I want to draw your attention to what Palaio has put up on the screen. This has been prepared by the budget division, as I understand it, and this gives you the process. Let me take the chat room off and then I'll see. Yes, this is the practice in the main committee. You have a chart. And it's a good idea, if you'd like to have this, to get this from UNITAR. to study it carefully, particularly if you're going to be involved in anything budgetary, to see how the process works. There are two processes, one in the main committee, which is what I explained to you, and then there's another one and another chart just before that that deals with the process in the plenary. Because in the plenary, your proposal doesn't go to any committee first, it goes straight to the House, to the floor of the General Assembly. And so that goes directly to the fifth committee if it's got money implications, and then they will consider it. ACABQ will consider what the SG thinks it's going to cost, and then they will prepare a report, comes back to plenary. So that's the process. Marco, would you like to add anything more to this? You're mute.
Need to add anything. The materials will be available to everybody. On relations to the question about what are the most the mistakes when you wanted to have resolutions to avoid, and you mentioned just one aspect, which is the financial one, and it's the heavy, the most important one because it's the heavy one, and you are totally right when you say when we make a proposal for a resolution in a committee or in the General Assembly, and that implies money, we have to take in mind that that proposal, that money will be split in a special formula, and every single country has to pay. So a particular percentage of that allocation, being $100,000 to $10 million, each country will have to pay. And then the scale of assessment in the fifth committee and the contribution of your country will be increased. And then you have to justify to your own government why the budget, I mean, the ordinary contribution of your country has increased in a yearly basis. And maybe you are the one who is creating this income increase to your contribution to the budget of the United Nations through a resolution. But there is another common mistake that you have to avoid. Never consider that an idea is for granted, for novel and for plain that it may see. There is someone or something that may bother a country, being human rights, being financial implications, be social implications, and things like that. So one mistake that you should avoid also is not taking be for sure approved, but as novel as it is, you have to be prepared to negotiate, and you have to get the most support you can from your friends, from your sub-region, and then from your region, and then amalgamate enough support to defend your idea, your proposal. Just a comment like that in relation to that question, that it goes with the negotiation process, and we will work more on that. For the ACVQ and the General Assembly, the main committees, I guess it's a straightforward process. Depending on the question, we can elaborate more on that. Back to you. Unmute.
Sorry, but now you can see why, because the money is so important, and if your proposal entails extra financial obligations, that in the past, delegations have tried to get around that by putting into, for example, the first committee proposal, that this conference will be absorbed within existing resources. And then they put it in the text and they walk away and they think, it's the Secretariat's problem. You have to find the money, but it's not going to cost anything, don't worry. And then they get all kinds of support. But of course, it's not the Secretariat that decides anyway, it's the fifth committee. It's the budget people, not the disarmament people, that decide if things are going to cost money or not. So that's why the ACABQ, as Sonia referred to, and I think it's always in the General Committee report, that the ACABQ has recommended very strongly that delegations not include in any proposal, this will be absorbed within existing resources. Only the fifth committee can really decide that. But you'll see that attempted from now and again. But normally, your own delegation's fifth committee people will try to police that. So I think I wanted to move on to what is the objective of your proposal, not in terms of content, but do you want consensus? Most of the time, delegations do, because the more they can get support and say all 193 members of the organization are in favor of your idea, your proposal, that's better. That's the best. And so often people, that's the point of negotiations, is to get as wide support, general agreement as possible. In the end, hopefully consensus. But of course, it's not always possible. Just like that human rights resolution that we talked about before, there are quite, there are a good number of resolutions in different committees on different subjects. A country or a region or a group that there's going to be opposition, and you can have amendments, you can have all kinds of procedural tools that are used. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But you should decide when you sit down to negotiate, are you only going to negotiate, do you know that there's going to be opposition, so you just need to get as big a block of supporters as possible? And you're the author, you're the owner of the text. And then you start going out and getting other countries to join as a co-sponsor. They then also author it as well. You can have a group of co-sponsors of 5 countries, or I think the one that we saw that was in the first committee was maybe 15 or 20 co-sponsors. There's no limit to co-sponsors. You could have 180 co-sponsors. And you will see that if new members are admitted, often the resolution 190 countries. But what you have to deal with is negotiating among the co-sponsors, because all of the co-sponsors have to agree to everything. So the more co-sponsors you have, can be more difficulty if there are differences and negotiations need to go forward, because the bigger group can make it more difficult to come to an agreement. So you have to decide, and by the way, you can decide not to accept somebody as a co-sponsor. You don't have a right to co-sponsor somebody else's text. You don't have that right. So what you're going to need, sometimes you will find that a certain country, the co-sponsors do not want that state listed with everybody else. And if you can have groups that co-sponsor resolutions, so it's only EU members or only AU members or only OAS members. Some budget decisions were co-sponsored by the United States and the USSR, and they would not allow anybody else to co-sponsor because they wanted to make the point that at that time they were the 2 largest contributors, that they wanted to speak as the largest donors to the organization. So that's one thing that will determine how you negotiate. It will also determine the language that you use. And it comes into an issue raised earlier about the editors. Now, if you're trained, if some of your professional training, particularly maybe if you're lawyers or whatever, you look for clarity and precision. So you know exactly what that resolution means and says. So it's clear. On the other hand, others say, no, we need constructive ambiguity, it's called. So you can have a resolution which is full of vague language that you're not quite sure what it means, and you may have the edit, and then once you have it proposed, you submit it, then you might have an editor from the Secretariat call you up and say, well, actually, what you should do is change this language to make it a little clearer. And then you have to explain to the editor, no, we don't want to make it clear. We want to get as wide a support as possible. So this is the problem that you have in drafting and your goal. If you want to have as many people as possible sign on or agree, you may have to compromise and water down your text so that it means different things to different people. I have to say that's dangerous because you can end up with a resolution with very different interpretations, and different results. So the clearer you can be, and yet as wide a support as possible is what is probably what is sought after in your negotiations. In terms of voting, we'll come to that tomorrow, but just bear in mind that for most resolutions, you need just a simple majority. Because if you're trying to get support, but you're also thinking about if this gets voted on, will it succeed? Will it be adopted? So under the rules, most resolutions are adopted by a vote of a simple majority of those present and voting. Now, this is a big difference between the council and the assembly here. For the assembly, it's a majority of those who vote yes or no. Abstentions are excluded from the count. So you never know ahead of time how many votes you need because you don't know the abstentions. So in theory, you could have a resolution 10 votes against and 5 abstentions. And that's just as valid as if the thing was adopted by 192 votes to nothing. And that's very different from the Security Council, where they need 9 yes votes for anything to be adopted. Anything to be adopted. So your strategy is a little different between the Assembly and the Council. But in any event, so you're looking at that for most of your resolutions. Some resolutions you need a higher majority. You need a 2/3 majority. So you're going to need more support than the normal resolution. And for that, actually, the easiest is to look in the rules of procedure, where Rule 83 of the rules of procedure talk about which questions in the General Assembly require a 2/3 majority of those present and voting. Not the ICJ, but Security Council, ECOSOC, trusteeship, admission of new members, suspension and expulsion of members, and the rather large basket of questions, recommendations with respect to maintenance of peace and security, and budgetary questions. Those require 2/3. And that means amendments, anything to do with those questions, the proposal, amendments, so on and so forth, require a 2/3 vote. So your bar is higher if you're dealing with a budgetary question or what can be considered a maintenance of international peace and security question. I see a good series, a good number of questions here that maybe I'll pick up here. How does a resolution get classified as important? That's where you'll see in the rule that I just mentioned. Rule, what was it, 83? Yes. In 83, straight from the charter. The charter in the rules of procedure, in the rules of procedure, some of the language is as you see it now, and then once you get to 83, it's not, in my version, that is in bold. In the hard copy version of the rules, certain rules are taken straight from the charter, and they're put in bold, which means you can't change those. That's the charter itself. So that's there. That gives you a list, but then the complication is Rule 84, because it could well be that the General Assembly at some point will decide, well, these are fine, they're in the charter, we know these are important questions, and we need a higher majority. But we have this other matter before us, and we think this is important too. So we think you need a higher majority in order to get this adopted. It's too important. We need as much. The General Assembly will take a specific decision that a particular proposal can be added to the list. Maybe it's not 83. Those are amendments. In any event, that can create a problem in terms of if you're going to add to the list of Rule 83 other questions. So let me see if there's other chat questions here. No. Okay, any other questions about you? This is still part of your strategy when you're deciding what you're going to put into your draft, and you don't want to make it, you want to make it as attractive as possible. Higher level of voting in case you think it's going to be subject to a vote. And by the way, the 2/3 majority question only applies to the plenary. It doesn't apply in the committee. So you have had some times when you've had a very controversial or evenly contested draft that gets adopted in a committee, and then it comes to the plenary. If it's a budgetary issue or if it's a maintenance of peace question, it goes to the plenary, and then all of a sudden it needs a higher threshold, 2/3. And then even though it was adopted in the committee, it'll fail when it gets to the plenary. It doesn't happen too often that the assembly adds to the important questions provisions of the charter. I think something occurred recently in the last year or so on the Palestinian question, where I think it was a draft that the U.S. had amended, and whether or not the amendment was put to the vote. And the question is whether or not the amendment passed or not. Well, it succeeded in getting a majority, but the president said, no, this is an important question. It had to do with the Palestinian question or occupied territories. Therefore, it's a maintenance of peace question. So it needed 2/3 to get adopted. And therefore, he declared that the American amendment was not adopted. Again, it doesn't happen too often, but you should be aware of it when you're drafting and when you're negotiating. Now, another thing you should bear in mind, and this is going to be, I think, come up unless we'll ask Kenji about it tomorrow. Article 19 of the Charter. So, as I mentioned before, about the only penalty you have for non-compliance with the Security Council has to deal with their own. If somebody disobeys a Chapter 7 binding decision. But in the GA, this talks about, in Article 19, if you don't pay your dues, because you're obligated to pay your dues as decided by the Assembly. Council has nothing to do with it. Then the Assembly, then you lose your vote in the GA. If the amount of the arrears equals or exceeds the amount of contributions due for the preceding 2 full years. So what happens is the Secretary General, twice a year, in January and in September, when a new session starts, will pass around a list, a document, which indicates these are the countries that are in arrears and cannot vote because they're too far behind. What is important to remember is there's a final sentence in that article that says the GA may nevertheless permit a member to vote if it's satisfied that the failure to pay is due to conditions beyond the control of that member. This is decided by the same subsidiary of the Fifth Committee on Contributions, that decides on your assessments. So they're individual experts. They will, and a country will come with their case. For example, if there's a hurricane, natural disaster, earthquake that has befallen the country and has affected its economy, and then the committee will make a recommendation that, yes, you can't pay because of conditions beyond your control. Now, my question to Kenji, but maybe Marco, you know already, we're in the middle of a COVID crisis. This has created an economic crisis as well. So what I wonder is whether states have begun to consider applying to the General Assembly in the Fifth Committee to say they can't pay their UN bill because of the current COVID crisis. We'll ask Kenji tomorrow, because it seems to me that I would expect that to be coming. Because if this crisis has disrupted the economies of many countries in the manner that I think it looks like, then countries may not be able to pay their UN bill. and they will then want the General Assembly, you have Article 19 in front of you, to give it dispensation so that they can get their vote back. So anyway, what I'm leading to is if you're going to do a lot of negotiating, make sure you, even though a country in arrears can co-sponsor your draft, you can't count on it for a vote if they're in arrears and they're in Article 19 situation. Let's move on to, let me see if there's any, I don't want to skip over directly relevant questions here. Then you have to decide how. Go ahead.
Do you have some questions over there? I don't know if you can see it. For example, the last question says, how often there is a difference in voting in the main committee and in the GA plenary? And if so, what can cause it? That's the last question, but there are like 3 or more questions pending.
Okay, I just enlarged it so I can see the other questions. Normally there is not a difference between the main committee and the GA. Sometimes it's simply attendance, and particularly you have to watch it towards the end of the session in December. It's a practical matter, it's not a legal matter. Because in the fifth committee can often take decisions either between Christmas and New Year's or just before a break, in which case you can have a good number of delegates who are not there in the fifth committee, and they may even be less if it's taken up a week later. People have left New York, where the committee is. Otherwise, if it's a difference in politics, you may get a committee, a delegate voting one way in the committee, and then it's normally several weeks or maybe a month before it comes up in the plenary, right? So in the meantime, you could have other politicking going on at a higher level with capitals, and probably the most you can get, often you don't get a change from yes to no, you get a change to abstention. So if the country that wants you to change your vote gets to your capital and foreign minister talks to foreign minister, you could have a change of vote from one way or the other to abstention to sort of back out of it. Otherwise, normally that's why done and they go boom, 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 and they ask delegates not to take the floor to repeat what you've already said in the main committee. For efficiency, what's the point in repeating the whole debate all over again in the plenary when you've already had it 4 weeks before in the main committee? So it doesn't happen very often.
One more question saying about the 2/3 majority in the committee and in the assembly. If there is an important question in a committee, for example, that the issue is raised, do they need 2/3 majority in the committee and then?
No, the 2/3 is only in the plenary, I believe. Let me check. I know. Yeah, it's not in the committees, the 2/3. What is in the committees, if you lose your vote, you lose your vote for financial reasons, you lose it in plenary and in the main committees. But the important issue only applies to the in fact, it's a kind of minor matter, but if Pelayo can go back and look at Rule 83, you see it just says Rule 83 and Rule 84. There's nothing in brackets. If you look at Rule 85, there's another number in brackets. What does that mean? The number in brackets is a rule for the committees, because the rules of procedure are divided between the conduct of proceedings in the plenary and conduct of business in the committees. So if you've got more or less the same rule, you'll see that like Rule 85. Rule 85 is in the plenary and Rule 125 is what is in the committees. And you can check, normally it reads the same. You'll see that these 2/3 provisions only apply to the plenary. There's nothing in brackets. It doesn't apply in the committees. Okay. Any other questions that I am missing? Let me check. What would you say about a single resolution or omnibus resolution? Pros and cons about them? Well, I suppose some of the resolutions indeed are very, very long, and maybe it's seen as more efficient to put them all together, put all issues together in one. So that's fine if there's general agreement. But if you have a proposal that you think, or if you have to be concerned about if you have 11 parts to your resolution and you've got one part which is contentious, you don't want that one part to doom the rest of your resolution, to force someone to abstain or vote no, even though they agreed to the other 10 parts. So separating it can lead to separating parts of a resolution into different drafts. It can lead to a more consensus. It's a matter of strategy, what you need. It depends on how much they're tied together, in fact. If they can stand separately, it might be better from a negotiation point of view to keep them separate. Am I missing any other questions?
Yeah. Options on the table to stop the action on a resolution. If yes, what are those options?
What strategies do you recommend? Sorry, where is it?
The last question is from Iraq. He says, does there any options on the table to stop the action on any resolution?
Yes.
And what are those?
Yeah. We'll deal with those tomorrow, but briefly, the most used option is a no action motion, which is invoking Rule 74 of the Rules of Procedure, by which the committee can decide that it doesn't want to take any action on your proposal. And they can decide that by a simple majority, and anybody can make that proposal make that motion. It's a procedural motion. They can make that motion as to a draft resolution or an amendment or those kinds of things, and we'll discuss that tomorrow. But that's probably the most common way that the committee can decide that to not to take up your proposal and to shelve it, to adjourn the debate on the item. Okay. If not, we'll go on to how you begin once you decide on your strategy, how many people you're going to invite to your meeting. Say you have your proposal, it's been cleared by your authorities, and most of the time delegations will then start circulating it as non-papers. So you don't give it to the secretary right away, normally. You normally give it to like-minded delegations that you think will be supportive and will be co-sponsors. And you try to get a critical core of co-sponsors that agree to all the words in the text and agree to put their country's name on it. And then you widen your negotiations where you think you can get support. And even if you are not sure you can get a yes support, perhaps you can get, so that you should check as well. You need to maybe go to other groups to explain what it means. What the main thing you want to make to reduce is any negative vote. You want to get as many positive and reduce the negative. So if you explain to different countries why they should support, they can do that. I'm sorry, was someone wishing to speak? No, okay. The chats I don't see anymore. Here we are. Don't see any more chats, but I may not have the most recent ones. Plow, you may have to tell me if there's some recent ones there. Could the different numerical system of the operative paragraphs for particular I'm not sure about that. I don't think the different numerical system of the operative paragraphs influence the sequence. I think the sequence of implementation depends on what it says in the text. Sometimes you have a goal that requires, say, 5 different steps, and sometimes those steps have to be taken in a particular order, so that if states or if the Secretariat first has to prepare a study, and then second, more or less following the study, that study is to be examined by a committee of experts, okay? And then after the committee of experts have examined the study, they are to make recommendations to step 3, recommend, that group of experts will make its recommendation to a special committee on something or other. So, sometimes there is an order to the implementation, and sometimes there's not. It all depends on the text. Okay. I want to then move on to when it's best to submit. And why is it important? Well, we'll get to that, the order of the voting. So say you have your non-paper and you've discussed it among like-minded delegations, or you have a group of co-sponsors, which can be a group or a regional group or an interest group, whatever. You have to decide when you want to give it to the Secretariat, and you make it a real document. And then it comes out as what's called an L document, which is a limited distribution. It doesn't mean limited in the UN sense, everybody gets it. It's an archival Secretariat. And then they will circulate it in 6 languages. They'll translate it. And then they'll give it a number, L1, 2, 3, 4. And the important thing there is to consider whether you want to be the first voted on or not. If you think there's going to be a competing resolution against yours, not just voting against it or not just amending it, but rather a totally different resolution, then you might want to get your resolution in first, submitted first, so that it gets the first number. Because under the rules, as a general rule, when the committee has to take action, they will take up proposals in the order of submission. And that's formal submission to the Secretariat. Not when you've circulated it as a non-paper. When you've given it to the Secretariat and the Secretariat has given it a number. So that you need to keep in mind. If you don't expect when you submit it. And different committees have different procedures. And in some ways, somebody should do a study as to the different practices in the different committees. I mean, certainly in the 6th committee, when I was there, you would not submit a resolution until after the debate on the topic, because the topics normally were reports from different commissions who would come in. So you would wait until you had a debate or discussion, you'd see what the general consensus was, and then you would have a draft resolution circulated, taking into account what the general views were. But in plenary, and then maybe in other cases, you circulate a draft right away from the very beginning. And then you have a discussion, which is basically a discussion on the draft. And then there can be changes to the draft and so on. So you have to, wherever you are, one of the main committees, you need to find out from the Secretariat, if not from your colleagues, what is the practice with regard to submission of resolutions and when is the best time to do it. In terms of when you want it taken up, that is basically in the hands of the plenary or in the main committees. Because each of the main committees, as you probably know, submits a program of work or devises a program of work at the beginning of the session of the GA. And they will give the dates when different items are going to be taken up. Some committees will then preserve, say, the last 2 weeks for decision taking, for voting. Other committees will sprinkle it in between. Anyway, in each committee, you will know when the deadline is over, that you will have deadlines for the submission of resolutions, and you should have, and you will ask from the chair, if you don't know, when is the anticipated decision making date? When do you intend to take this up for decision? That way you will know how to strategize, getting as much support as possible, and you know when to be there, so that things are not done in your absence, which can happen. So that you need to pay attention in your own individual committees and in the plenary of the General Assembly. Any questions? Oh, by the way, the co-sponsors, we'll deal with this tomorrow, but the co-sponsors, once you put your name as an author of a proposal, you don't get to explain your vote. You can obviously speak in the debate and explain why you are co-authoring it and why you're supporting it. But in terms of the vote take, everybody assumes you're going to vote yes because it's your own proposal. You don't need to explain why you're voting in favor of it. It's there for everyone to see. Where do these resolutions come from? What we've been talking about has the way I've been addressing it is that it's a delegation. You as the delegation of country X are making this proposal. And that is for the most part what happens. But it's not always that way. And but for the most part, it needs to be governments that make proposals and member states. There are specific provisions adopted by the Assembly for Palestine, the state of Palestine, and for Holy See, that they can co-sponsor resolutions, certain resolutions, but they cannot be put to the vote unless a member state has asked for them, and they cannot co-sponsor alone. Those are particular resolutions. I have the reference for if you need those. But otherwise, it's governments. Sometimes it's groups, and particularly I think in the second committee, Marco, where you have the G77, or in a committee you may have the African group, but of course it's the African group of states, of member states. Sometimes in the past they would put a footnote to say the African group of states is composed of the following member states, so you know which countries have signed on to the resolution. I think in the plenary they still do not do that. In the plenary they still require the individual countries on the draft proposal, so you know who's responsible for the piece of paper. For you, the worst thing is you have a proposal, but you don't know whose it is. You don't know where it came from. You don't know who to talk to about it. So that's always avoided. You always need to know from whence something came. You could also have a draft resolution that comes from a subsidiary body. If any of you have been in various committee on the charter or committee on peacekeeping operations, I think a number of these committees that work during the year and they prepare a report for the General Assembly will put at the end a draft resolution that they have already negotiated, cooked, and they will recommend to the General Assembly here's a resolution, this is what the committee recommends that you adopt. And in that case, it's governments still, but it's governments through the special committee, whichever committee it is. So you could have that where a committee chair will say, well, we can turn to paragraph 97 of the report of the special committee on the charter, which has a draft resolution that they recommend. This is what's before the committee. But it just is another source for draft resolutions. Normally it's governments, it can be groups, regional groups of governments, or it can be like-minded, it could be EU, for example, things like that. And it can come from a committee itself. Now, the last one I want to mention is it comes from an officer of the committee. Sometimes before a debate, during, after a debate, if the chair senses or if the tradition is that this item is contentious or there are different views, and there needs to be negotiations, or particularly if there are competing resolutions, then the chair will propose to the committee that in order to advance common agreement, general agreement, consensus, meeting of the minds, the chair would propose trusted with the task of conducting informal consultations among all the parties, all the members of the committee, or whoever's interested, to try to come up with a common text that everyone can agree on. So this is often used, and then it's the officer of the committee, and then the committee authorizes the chairman, says, yes, that's a good idea, so decided. So sometimes it's the chair, whichever one of the 5 officers are agreed upon, that undertakes consultations all on the side to try to come up with to bridge the gap, as it were, between competing views. When that comes back, if there's an agreement, then it will say draft resolution submitted by the first vice chairman on the basis of consultations, something like that, okay? So on that, it's that text which will be put to the vote. Co-sponsors of the other versions have not insisted on a vote, therefore we'll take this up and take a decision on it. What the Secretariat, or at least the legal office, would always make clear to that officer is that officer is acting as a neutral. He doesn't take sides. He tries to bridge the gap and come to common agreement. If you cannot get agreement, if there's still opposition, then he should not produce any text at all, because his job is as all these officers are appointed by the committee as a whole and owe their jobs and do the job for the committee as a whole, and should not enter the fray if there continues to be opposition. So that's where your resolutions can come from, either individual governments, groups of governments, regional groups, other resolutions come from subsidiary organs and reports, and from officers of a committee, or you can have officers of the plenary as well, of course. The president of the plenary can ask a particular vice president to conduct negotiations. So this takes place. This can take place at plenary as well. Any questions on that? If you can.
I have 2 questions, Larry. One is, based on practice, are usually co-sponsor resolutions getting more votes? And the other one is related to the Article 19. What is the criteria to determine conditions to prevent any state from paying non-financial contributions? And who is the one who assess that request?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I got your first question, but that is determined by the controller, by the Secretary General. The scale of assessments everyone knows, that what the percentage is of the budget that you owe, and then the controller on behalf of the Secretary General will send out the bills to member states, I suppose January, February, March, and the process begins like that. And then when he has to, then the Secretary General will indicate to the General Assembly what countries have been in arrears for 2 straight years, calendar years. And then the appeal is not to the Secretary General, but it goes to the General Assembly, into the 5th Committee, and to the Committee on Contributions. So that's how, so it ends up to be a political, in some ways, for a number of years, it was a highly political matter, and from the very beginning, to make it a political issue, and then it was almost a popularity contest, whether you liked certain countries and would let them get the vote, and others you would not let them get the vote back. So the General Assembly has put it into the Committee on Contributions. It's an expert body. It's a financial matter. The charter says it's beyond its capacity, beyond its control, and that they have considered, member states have considered to be a financial matter. Failure is due to conditions beyond the control of the member. So that is all debated in the Committee on Contributions in a confidential meeting, I think, where the member state making the request will lay out its financial situation and why it believes it cannot pay due to conditions beyond its control. And what was the first question, Marco?
Based on practice, are usually co-sponsor resolutions getting more votes? Co-sponsor resolutions.
Yeah, get more votes?
Yes.
Yes, I think in general, I mean, as the question this morning, there is a little bit of a difference between being a co-sponsor and just being in support of a resolution. Being a co-sponsor means that it is that every single word in there is your position as a government, and your government has approved it, and your capital has approved it for the most part. I mean, all depends internally. So that the more co-sponsors you have, it looks better for you to get more support from those that might not want to co-sponsor, but might want to support it as being a good idea. But I don't think there's a hard and fast rule on that. And it depends on who the other co-sponsors, who the co-sponsors are. If it's a regional group, you know, if you have the African line of the G77 it might be more favorable to vote in favor, you know, than other groups. So I don't know, Marco, if you have any views on that.
Not really, but this is true when you negotiate the resolution and then you embody support from different member states, from different regions, you will get more support. Let's say it is a conflictual resolution and the resolution has to be voted. As much sponsors as you may get, at least you can secure that the resolution may pass. If it's a consensus resolution and they have an X number of sponsors, there is no reason why the large majority of member states will support that resolution. So it embodies the text of a resolution with a strong support, and that starts from your sub-region. Let's say any country from Central America, which encompass 13 countries or something like that, decided to put together a resolution. If they manage to align these 13 countries, and each one of these countries may get one support additional to that, multiplied by 2, and so on. So it's more doable that the resolution will pass without any problem. When there is a contested resolution and then there is a vote envisaged for that resolution, you manage to negotiate to concede the most you want against the sponsorship, because that's what will guarantee that you will succeed in the resolution. And then the other thing that you have to really take into consideration is that, do you really need to concede if the vote in a resolution is really imminent? What will you concede if you know that somebody presents amendments? What will you ask that country that present amendments that you know there will be a voted in your resolution? At least you can say, okay, I can add this language in this para because you wanted that. Will you sign the resolution as co-sponsor? And so on. It's a process in which you have to measure your interest and the cost benefit of your idea and your proposal in order to succeed. The other thing that you can do is, I shouldn't be giving this advice to you, but Larry mentioned COVID, and I imagine a lot of countries will start to thinking now how to use COVID not to pay their dues. Don't say that UNITAR discuss these things in a training session. So is the idea that, and many countries do that, and don't be surprised if you face this reality. You have a draft resolution, you have an idea, you have been instructed to go through, and 3 or 4 countries oppose it for whatever another resolution going on in a different committee, something like that. What you will do is you wanted to get certain amount of parity and your idea be considered seriously by that delegation. You move on the other delegates, and then you do what they are doing to you in your committee. You present amendments, or you try it with some. You have to create a leveling playing field for negotiation of your interest. Do not concede just because you have to concede because somebody told you, I don't like this, you go away with this. So the rule of procedures that Larry was mentioned to you are your tools, are your weapons to negotiate, not to be disruptive, to be constructive in order to manage to get your ideas going through this process. And I mentioned this now because I saw in the agenda that this is related to defining objectives by rule of procedures application, motion of action, postponing of a meeting, suspension of a meeting. Those are more specific. But it says creating, assessing, analyzing information. And that's what you have to do when you have an idea or you have instructions to present a resolution in any committee or in the General Assembly. You have to be very analytical. You have to be very cold. You have to be very prepared to go to certain length of your capacities and to use these tools in the rule of procedures in order to make this a success story for you. I just wanted to add that. I don't know if help.
Oh yeah, no, very good, very good. Thank you. I see a couple questions, some of which we'll deal with tomorrow, such as if you can change your vote once you make it. The short answer is no, but we'll discuss that tomorrow. And informals. And this goes beyond my experience, at least in the legal field. You didn't have informals and informals, and then maybe informals. But I think you have it in the Fifth Committee and some other committees. And some of it, I mean, informal working groups can be as formal as any other meeting and can be in the trusteeship council with nameplates and with, you know, almost with the rules of procedure being followed. Or you can have informals in conference rooms. Well, when one is meeting in the building, in small committee rooms with just interested delegations. So, and whoever convenes the informals, they decide how informal it's going to be, because the rules of procedure do not apply to informal meetings unless the chair wants to. So it all depends. For the most part, people prefer informals. And if they, you know, and without any formality, so that one can be more open and can make ideas and suggest possible compromises without it being put into stone. I did want to mention another factor why one would maybe want to be a co-sponsor, because then, as I said, you're an owner of it, of the text, and say you're with 25 other co-sponsors. You will meet as co-sponsors and you will consider suggestions for changing your text. So obviously you have a say in whether or not your text should be changed, whether some delegation has said, we'd love to be a co-sponsor, but you need to add this idea, or you need to change it by doing this, that, or the other thing. And so as a co-sponsor, you have a decision in how the text can be changed. Because once you submit the text, as long as it hasn't been voted on, you can change it. And this is what the revs mean, that Rev 1, Rev 2 that I referred to earlier. The co-sponsor can say, well, now I've consulted more widely. These are the changes I've made. Here's the revision 1 to attract more support. As a co-sponsor, you're at the table for that, and that may be important for you. You can say no to the changes, and if, you know, and the group has to decide how they're going to make decisions. And if they end up changing it, you can withdraw your name. As long as it hasn't been voted on, your government, you can say, we are no longer a co-sponsor. They've made a change which my government cannot accept. And that's the difference between revision and amendments. Often that's but there is a technical difference. An amendment is almost always hostile. If you want the sponsors to change something, please revise it, and you get my support if you do that. And if they end up saying no, you have to decide whether that's really important to you or not. If they've rejected your idea, you can then go to the floor and make an amendment to change the text by a vote. And that's why amendments are basically hostile, and revisions are, a friendly amendment, as it were, a friendly revision. And you can take care. You can increase your support by making quite a few changes, as long as it doesn't affect the core of your proposal as you see it. And you can always withdraw your proposal as long as the committee hasn't acted on it, because it's still your proposal. If at the end of the day you think you don't have a majority, then the co-sponsors can say, no, we'll come back next year and withdraw it. And then it disappears unless somebody else wants to resubmit it. It's not yours anymore. So be careful of that, because if you think an amendment is coming that you don't like, but if an amendment then gets adopted to your text, and you have opposed that amendment, and now your text has it inside it, you may want to withdraw your text, because it's no longer your text. Somebody has added something that you think is poisonous. You can't withdraw it then. It's too late. Too late. Once the committee has acted on it, to get a little bit more tomorrow. Where these things are going to be debated, these proposals, we talked about that this morning. Various items are allocated to the 6 committees, and some items are kept in the plenary. So you have to see where your agenda item is and where your resolution is going to be debated. Start, because that determines in many ways the procedures of getting your proposal negotiated and onto the floor. Now, do you have a right? Let me just finish this, and then we're done for the giving the negotiation texts. Do you have a right, an absolute right, to insist that your proposal be voted upon? And the answer is no. Often you think so, and often your policymakers back home, and if they're not familiar with parliamentary practices, they may think, well, if my government has put its name on a proposal, I have a right to have that voted on. And the answer is no, you don't. You have in a couple of rules that deal with that, and the most important one is Rule 7. No country can stop you such, but the committee, a country can stop you by making a proposal that the committee decide they don't want to take action on your idea, on your proposal. That's the no action motion under Rule 74. And that has been used for years and years, and we'll discuss it tomorrow in a little bit more detail. And also, if you have 2 competing resolutions, and the one gets voted on, and that really makes no sense to take up the second resolution, which is completely different or completely opposed to it. So the chair, and that's in Rule 91, where it says the committee can decide not to take up a resolution if a resolution on the same subject matter has already been decided upon. So bear that in mind, and that can take that can help guide you in your strategy, whether or not you want to submit yours first, if you think you're going to have a competing text, and also whether you want to try to avoid a no action motion against your proposal. In some ways, that's political or politics at its best, where you have to have intelligence on the ground, whether your opposition is planning anything. And so you can get your fellow co-sponsors in line to make sure that, say, a no action motion is defeated and you're ready for it and you're not surprised. I mean, that's the one thing that, as Marco said, the rules of procedure are there as your tools, but you can use them and they can be used against you. And those from very strong parliamentary traditions know that if you don't know the rules, your opposition can come back and slap you on the head without what the opposition is thinking, possible opposition. And another thing, as we end and we go to questions, if you really want to say somebody, make nervous, I'll put it that way, in the committee, once the committees start meeting, or maybe even in sessions, just pull this out, rules of procedure, and make it look like you're going through it. And the other side will wonder immediately, what is he doing? What is he looking for? What does he have in mind? What is he planning? And so always have your rules of procedure with you if you can get a hard copy, just to use as a device to make the other side nervous. Anyway, what other questions do we have here? What are the legal implications in case the vote is abstaining on a draft resolution already co-sponsored? You mentioned the case if the initiator or group of delegations, is it possible for the individual initiator to decide who to join the list of co-sponsors? Not on that last part. Once you have a group of co-sponsors, unless the co-sponsors decide otherwise, everybody is equal, even if the initial sponsor was one country. If everybody else is a co-sponsor, then everybody would determine whether to let somebody in as well as a co-sponsor. And decision-making within groups of co-sponsors, I have never been in a group of co-sponsors, so I don't know how that works. Normally, the co-sponsors would agree on everything, including who to add onto the list of co-sponsors. But I'm not quite sure I understand the first part of the question. What are the legal implications in case the pattern of voting is abstentions on a resolution already co-sponsored? Maybe you could clarify that. And anything else? Maybe you will address this in the next hour. Yeah, elaborate more on the best strategies to ensure your resolution is to be voted on. When to use binding language, when to use constructive ambiguity. I think I can't add any more than what I think Marco and I discussed earlier in terms of broadening your support to get as much support as possible. You have to decide to what extent ambiguous language dilutes what you're trying to get, or is it sufficient to dilute it a little bit to get a compromise and to get more support? So it all depends on what the text is and how much latitude you have, in fact, because if you're acting on instructions, and most of the time you are, even if they're very broad and vague instructions, you need to make sure that your government is still okay with changing the text in order to get broader agreement. Any other points?
Would you consider in a committee or in the GA?
The order is, as I think I mentioned before, is the order of submission. So the rule, and we'll refer to it tomorrow, says proposals are taken up in the order of, or normally or in general, taken up in the order of submission. The committee can always change that if it relates to the same subject matter. So you get your document in and it's got L1, that will be taken up ahead of other resolutions or proposals that come in later with later numbers. You can get into some procedural confusion if L3 says, I see I'm unstable. If L3 says, no, I want to be first. So then the chair has to go through the process of, is that a formal proposal to change the norm? That's another piece that comes tomorrow, but in fact is obvious even now, that your chairperson has an extremely important role to play. And these positions should not just be seen as honorific or those with a certain title or level. They need to be persons who are able to put it bluntly, think on their feet and to listen, and because they will have to judge, they will be and can be bombarded with procedural motions and points of order, and they will be called upon to rule on those points of order, and they may have secretariat support. They should have secretariat support. But in the end of the day, they are the ones, the chairperson is the one that rules from the chair and bangs the gavel. And they have to know what's going on, and they have to know how to read the room, and they should also be active in consulting. They have the bureau that they will consult with, which represents the five, the groups, regional groups. But they have to be, sometimes chairpersons are in a very difficult position, and they need to be very competent people. Any more comments, questions? Did I miss any questions?
There is one over there. Did you see it?
No.
It's come from Al-Shaikili from Iraq. It says, to further elaborate my question, if X delegation receive instructions to vote in abstention for a draft resolution, the same delegation is one of the co-sponsors. The resolution, if you are instructed to do so.
Absolutely, I think you can. It just frankly is embarrassing because you co-sponsored it, and I think the other co-sponsors would say, well, why didn't you withdraw your name? If you're not going to vote in favor of it, you should have withdrawn your name from the list. Of the text and then vote. So, in any vote, who knows? You can have a change of government. One week you could have one prime minister thinks it's a great idea, and the next week you could have another prime minister, another foreign minister that says, "Oh, I'm not so sure now, so maybe we should abstain." But probably the proper way to go about it is to say, "Well, I've received new instructions," because you can always announce just before the vote. The chairperson can say, the following are additional co-sponsors. And the chairperson can also say, country X has withdrawn from sponsorship. So you get that out in the record first, before the vote. That would be proper if anybody asked proper procedure. If you got an instruction like that, I think you should maybe get back to whoever sent it and said, look, I think we may need to pull our name from being a co-sponsor of the text then. Wouldn't you agree? And then handle it that way.
Are there any more questions or comments on the floor?
No other questions?
We don't have any more questions.
Tomorrow we deal with the decision voting.
Tomorrow we have decision making.
Take a look at the rules. Tomorrow, I could mention, even in preparation for tomorrow, credentials. Credentials aren't really normally considered in decision making, but one of the reasons that who is authorized by government to represent the country and therefore to vote for the country. So that's why you have credentials and you have credentials reports and so on and so forth. That it has not been much controversy lately. In other years, it's been highly controversial dealing with credentials of various member states at the time. But it's considered a technical matter. Credentials are sent in by and signed by one of three magic persons: the head of state, head of government, or minister for foreign affairs. And credentials, those are not proper credentials. It needs to be signed by one of those three persons. And the missions keep Office of Protocol and the legal office inform who are the persons that hold those three positions and who are entitled to sign. You can have provisional credentials signed by an ambassador or note verbal, but those are all considered provisional credentials, which are still valid for voting purposes and so on. But in any event, that sometimes that does occur because you might wonder, well, who's over there voting for country X, and you've never seen that person before, and you want to avoid any credentials challenges like that. And with that in mind, there's one final point which rarely comes up, but might, particularly if that situation arises, if once the meeting from country X and somebody completely new, or actually no, if you see that your neighbor from country X, some other delegate from another country is sitting there and is ready to vote, what do you do? How is that possible? Proxies are allowed if, for example, the delegate of, let me just take an example, Italy has been requested to by the delegation of Nauru to vote for Nauru on a particular day, election or voting on something. Then what the Secretariat needs to do is to have a credential for that Italian delegate that says, for the election to the Security Council, Mr. So-and-so and so is going to be representing the Republic of Nauru. And it has to be signed by the foreign minister, head of state or head of government of Nauru, yes. And then he can sit behind the sign of Nauru, but there can be no confusion. He cannot go back and forth between Italy and Nauru that day. He has to be a Nauru delegate for that particular day. So that's how that works. It doesn't happen very often, but in cases of tight elections, sometimes, particularly for individuals, judges in various courts and so on, or positions in councils, every single vote counts, and you will have proxies. Anyway, that's just for a footnote. It doesn't happen very often. No questions?
I don't see any more questions. No. So anyway, so we can proceed like we did early this morning. You can send us comments or questions and we can tackle those tomorrow. We will continue conversation with Mr. Johnson. We're going to talk about the rule of procedures, and in particular decision-making process, the quorum, the revision of amendment, explanation of vote before the vote, procedural motions, Rule 74, 75, suspension of the meeting, voting, and so on. It's about 2 hours. Before we went to about 1 p.m., we will have Mr. Kenji Nakano for the decision-making in COVID era in the General Assembly. There has many decisions that has been going on and taken out in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly is not meeting as it's supposed to meet. And so the Assembly adopted a series of decisions in order to tackle the most pressing needs. And so Kenji, who works in the conference management branch, will explain to us how that process is happening. At the same time, you may be able to pop questions about the upcoming 75th session of the General Assembly, because there is many things that has to be decided on modalities on how the assembly will be held and what are the considerations from the PGA office and the conference management affairs. As of today, we have the high-level political forum all totally virtually, and all the meetings since March has been done through this Teams platform. For the Secretariat of the UNITAR, we are using Zoom. Assembly is a different setup. And so there is in consideration recently to have an extraordinary session of the General Assembly for COVID. I guess they are coming into the terms when this assembly going to be held. It's an extraordinary session and has been promoted by the representative of what is Azerbaijan, has chair or coordinator of the non-aligned movement. So we can have this little chat with Kenji tomorrow at 1 p.m. Of course, before that, we will have Larry Johnson on this decision-making process, quorum, voting, and particular. So think a little bit about those topics, read a little bit, and then we see you tomorrow about 9:45. We will start at 10, as far I know, yes. So I hope we can count with you tomorrow. Thank you very much for your participation today. It has been very, very rich, the exchange. The sessions are recording, as you know, and these links will be posted when we complete the whole session. Please send us an email, those who are really interested in the guidelines, to have it you as a first come, first served basis to arrange for you. And then whatever other needs you may have, UNITAR is here to support and to help you. So keep in touch and see you tomorrow, 9:45, 10 a.m. in the morning. Larry, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
No, see you tomorrow, and have a good evening now from New York.
Very good. Have a good evening, and thanks for all your questions.